Near the end of the 1700s, a naturalist named Benjamin Smith Barton sat at a writing desk in Philadelphia trying to solve a question that had bothered European settlers for 2 centuries. Who had lived in North America before the nations they could see? In his book, he set down a single strange line he had gathered from Cherokee country. There had once been a people in these mountains, a moon-eyed people who could not see during the day. The Cherokee, he wrote, had found them already here and had driven them west. More than 1,000 miles to the south, on a mountain in North Georgia, there is a wall of piled stone that runs along the ridge for close to 900 feet. Nobody wrote down who built it. Nobody recorded why. It was already old and already abandoned when the first surveyors climbed up to measure it. So we are left with 2 things that do not quite belong to the same world. A written memory of a people who came before and a stone wall on Fort Mountain that came before as well. Do they have anything to do with each other? Or has a crowded and forgotten past simply left 2 echoes that a later century braided into one? To look at that honestly, we have to start with the thing you can still walk up to today. Not the legend, but the wall itself, sitting on the ridge of Fort Mountain in Murray County, Georgia. Fort Mountain rises at the southern edge of the Cohutta Range in the blue folds of the North Georgia Appalachians. Near the summit, along the highest ground, a low wall of stacked stone winds through the oak and pine. It is a dry-laid wall, which means it was built without mortar, without cement, just fitted stone resting on stone. It stands between 2 and 6 feet high in the places where it survives, and it runs, in its full length, close to 900 feet across the crest of the ridge. It does not run straight, it zigzags, bending back on itself, tying into the natural granite boulders and rock outcrops, as if whoever built it wanted the mountain itself to do part of the work. Along its length, there are shallow pits and low mounds of collapsed stone, the kind of features that look deliberate but refuse to explain themselves. The first thing an archaeologist notices about the Fort Mountain Wall is how much labor it represents and how little sense it makes as a fortification. It does not enclose anything. It does not ring the summit the way a defensive wall should. A person could simply walk around the ends of it. It faces no obvious enemy and guards no obvious spring or village. 19th century visitors called it a fort out of habit, because a wall on a mountaintop looked like defense to European eyes, and the name stuck to the mountain itself. But the stones do not agree with the name. When antiquarians first climbed Fort Mountain in the 1800s, they measured the wall and argued about it, and they kept reaching for the same handful of explanations. Some counted what looked like gateways, low gaps spaced along the line, and decided the wall must have been a defensive rampart with entrances. Others noticed the shallow pits behind the stone and imagined shelters or firing positions or signal points. None of it held together. A rampart that anyone can walk around is not much of a rampart, and the pits could as easily be places where stone was quarried as places where people hid. The honest summary, then and now, is that the Fort Mountain Wall was built with real effort by people who knew exactly what they were doing for a reason they did not leave behind. There are more of these than most people realize. Across the southern Appalachians, from Georgia up into the Carolinas and Tennessee, there are scattered stone walls, stone piles, and low enclosures on high ground. Some are natural, some are the leftovers of 19th century farmers clearing fields. But a handful, like the wall on Fort Mountain, sit in places no farmer would bother, on rocky summits with no soil to plow, and they have the weathered, lichen-covered look of real age. Georgia's Department of Natural Resources now protects the Fort Mountain Wall inside Fort Mountain State Park, with a stone observation tower standing near one end of it, built much later by a completely different set of hands. And there is one more physical object worth holding on to. In the Museum of the Cherokee Indian in Cherokee, North Carolina, there is a small carved soapstone figure, a pair of joined bodies, that has come to be associated with the moon-eyed people in living Cherokee storytelling. It is a small thing you could hold in 2 hands. It is also, like the wall, an object without a caption, a piece of stone that people point to when they tell this story. If you enjoy quiet documentaries that trace forgotten history through old records, archaeology, and indigenous tradition, take a second to subscribe, because it genuinely helps these longer pieces reach the people who like them. Because the wall on Fort Mountain is only half of this story. The other half was written down by name, with dates, and that written half is where the moon-eyed people actually enter the record. The oldest printed mention comes from that naturalist in Philadelphia, Benjamin Smith Barton. In 1797, he published a book with the heavy title, New Views of the Origin of the Tribes and Nations of America. Tucked inside it is the line that started everything. Barton reported a Cherokee account of a moon-eyed people who could not see in the daytime, an earlier population that the Cherokee said had lived in the country before them. Barton did not visit Fort Mountain. He was collecting and comparing stories, the way naturalists of his era collected and compared everything, and he wrote the phrase down and moved on. A generation later, the account resurfaced. In 1823, a Tennessee judge and historian named John Haywood published his Natural and Aboriginal History of Tennessee. Haywood gathered local Cherokee traditions and repeated the idea of a white, dim-sighted people who had lived in the region and been pushed out. By now, the story had two printed sources that agreed on the strange central detail: a people who saw poorly in sunlight, who lived here first, and who left. Then, at the very end of the 1800s, the account reached the person who mattered most for its survival. James Mooney was an ethnologist with the Bureau of American Ethnology, part of the Smithsonian Institution, and he spent years in the 1880s and 1890s living among the eastern band of Cherokee in North Carolina, learning the language and writing down everything they were willing to share. In 1900, he published the result, a thick volume called Myths of the Cherokee. Inside it, Mooney set the moon-eyed people into the wider body of Cherokee history he had recorded. He repeated Barton's phrase about a people who could not see in the daytime, and he added the piece that ties the story to the land. When the Cherokee came into the country north of the Hiwassee River, Mooney recorded, they found it already inhabited by another people who then went west. In some tellings, those earlier people were described as very small and perfectly white. It is worth pausing on how unusual Mooney's position was. He was not a tourist collecting a spooky campfire tale. He worked for the federal government's Bureau of American Ethnology, he learned to speak Cherokee, and he sat with elders of the eastern band in the mountains of western North Carolina over a period of years. When he wrote a tradition down, he was recording what living people told him about their own past, in their own language, at a time when much older knowledge still moved by word of mouth. That does not make every detail literally true. It does mean the Moonite account is not a 19th century invention. It was already old when Barton first heard of it in the 1790s, and it was still being carried 100 years later when Mooney arrived. The detail about the earlier people going west is the piece that stays with you, not destroyed, not vanished into thin air, but relocated. The way one people gives way to another across a landscape and a lifetime. So the written record is real, and it is checkable. 3 named sources across a full century, all circling the same odd shape. That is more than most legends can claim. But a written record is not the same as a solved case, and this is exactly the point where an honest documentary has to slow down and let the skeptics speak, because the simplest reading of all of this is not a lost civilization. It is a chain of retellings. Start with the wall. Every serious study of the Fort Mountain Wall has concluded that it is an indigenous construction. An archaeologist named Philip E. Smith examined it in the 1960s, and later work placed it firmly within the range of Native American stone building, most likely between the year 500 and the year 1500. In 1977, the site was added to the National Register of Historic Places as a prehistoric Native American structure. The people who built the wall on Fort Mountain were almost certainly the ancestors of the region's indigenous nations, not a pale race from across an ocean. Now the moon-eyed people themselves. The most grounded explanation is medical. A people who cannot see well in daylight and who are described as unusually pale is a fair description of albinism, which can run in a community across generations and which affects both skin and eyesight. A group with a high rate of albinism could easily become, in memory and retelling, a whole separate people of the night. Others read moon-eyed more simply, as people who saw better after dark than in glare, a description rather than a species. And then there is the theory that has to be named and then set down, because it hangs over this whole subject. For 2 centuries, some writers tried to turn the moon-eyed people into Europeans. The favorite candidate was Madoc, a Welsh prince who supposedly sailed to America in the 12th century, long before Columbus. The Madoc story was used over and over to argue that white people had reached America first and therefore had some prior claim to the land. Historians regard the Welsh Madoc voyage as a myth, unsupported by any real evidence, and the attempt to graft it onto Cherokee tradition tells you far more about colonial politics than about the Cherokee past. That door leads nowhere, and we are going to leave it closed, which leaves us suspended exactly where this format likes to sit. The wall is real and indigenous, the record is real and repeated. The lost white race is not. And yet the Cherokee account of finding a people already here does not vanish just because the wildest explanation fails, because here is the part the debunked does not erase. The Cherokee traditions that Mooney recorded are not simply entertainment. To the Cherokee, they are history and identity, the account of how the nation came to live where it lives. And that account contains a clear and repeated idea that when the Cherokee arrived in the southern mountains, other people were already there and then moved on. Archaeology agrees with the general shape of that, even as it rejects the fantasy versions. The southern Appalachians were not empty before the historic Cherokee. People lived in these valleys for thousands of years, through the long stretch archaeologists call the Woodland period, and the Mississippian era that followed, building mounds, villages, and, in a few high places, walls of stone. Cultures rose and shifted and gave way to others across that immense span of time. A nation arriving into that landscape would, in a real sense, be arriving into a place already shaped by people who had come before, some of whom had indeed moved away. You do not have to go far from Fort Mountain to feel how deep that past runs. A short drive to the south, near Cartersville, Georgia, the Etowah Indian mounds rise out of the river valley, 3 great flat-topped earthen platforms raised by a Mississippian people between roughly the year 1000 and the year 1500. Those builders had a city, a plaza, carved stone figures, and a trade network that reached across half a continent. They flourished, and then that world too came apart before Europeans ever saw it. The southern Appalachians are layered with this kind of deep time. Woodland peoples building burial mounds, Mississippian towns rising along the rivers, whole ways of life beginning and ending across thousands of years, most of it never written down by anyone. Against that background, a stone wall on a mountaintop and a memory of a people who came first are not exotic at all. They are 2 small windows into a landscape that was populated and repopulated again and again. So line the pieces up gently without forcing them. The Cherokee recorded a memory of earlier inhabitants. The mountains contain physical proof of earlier inhabitants, including a stone wall on Fort Mountain that predates the historic Cherokee Nation. Both point back into the same deep past. The obvious objection is the one worth answering directly. If these earlier people left such a wall, why is there no clear record of who they were? And the answer is almost boring in its honesty. Pre-contact peoples of the Southeast did not leave written histories. Their stone and earthen works weathered and were reused, and the arrival of Europeans shattered the very communities that carried the oldest oral memory. The record is thin, not because the people were mysterious, but because so much was lost. None of that proves the wall was built by the Moon-eyed people. It is entirely possible the wall and the tradition have nothing to do with one another, 2 separate echoes of a crowded past that later listeners braided into one story. That is the honest position. The convergence is a question, not an answer. Here is what nobody seriously disputes. The wall on Fort Mountain exists, and you can walk its length today. It is old, and it is indigenous. The Cherokee preserved and shared a tradition of a people who lived in these mountains before them. 3 named writers, from 1797 to 1900, recorded that tradition in print. Those are the solid stones, and they hold weight. Here is where the questions begin. We do not know who built the Fort Mountain Wall, or what it was for, whether it marked a boundary, tracked the movement of the sun over the Cohutta Range, or served some purpose that left no trace we can read. We do not know whether the Moon-eyed people were a real distinct community, a memory of albinism, or a compression of many vanished groups into one. And we do not know, and may never know, whether the hands that stacked those stones and the people the Cherokee remembered are the same hands at all. In the fall, the ridgeline of Fort Mountain turns gold and rust as the hardwoods change, and hikers on the state park trail step over the low stone line without always knowing what it is. The wall does not announce itself. It simply lies there along the crest, the same fitted stones a person set down more than 1,000 years ago, holding their shape through every winter since. Walk up Fort Mountain today, and the wall is still there, running along the ridge under the oaks, its stones furred with lichen, ending for no reason that a visitor can see. Stand beside it, and you are standing next to a decision someone made more than 1,000 years ago. A decision to carry stone to the top of a mountain and lay it in a line and then to stop. In the museum in Cherokee, North Carolina, the small soapstone figure sits in its case, joined bodies carved from a single block, waiting the way the wall waits. History is rarely settled by a single wall or a single sentence in an old book. It is assembled slowly, one survey, one excavation, one carefully recorded tradition at a time, and some of it stays permanently out of reach. The Moon-eyed people sit in that unreachable zone, named in the record, pointed at by the stone and never fully explained. Thank you for walking up the mountain with me. If you want more of these, the kind that follow a single thread of North American history until it disappears into the ground, consider subscribing, because that is exactly what the next one does. Until then, a question worth sitting with. When the Cherokee said they found people already here, and when the wall on Fort Mountain says the same thing in stone, who was it that came before, and where in the end did they go?